Hello and welcome to CultureShop. In this edition, we're looking at the buying cycle and how a little forward thinking could bring big dividends for your shop.
It's CultureShop.
So we have a buying cycle. We usually buy seasonally and then again to fit in with the temporary exhibitions. Usually starts with a brainstorm and going to the trade shows and seeing what's out there, looking at the different trends and buying into that, and then trying to tie them into events and exhibitions.
I have two calendars really. The first one is preparing to go to trade fairs in January, February, March for new product that's going to come in at Easter or thereabouts for the tourist season.
Planning for the shop ranges is constant, actually. It's constantly being reviewed and edited, and we have to be very reactive.
Because we're on the high street, we also have Christmas that is busy for us, so we have a second calendar that is probably May, June, which looks at what we're going to get in September, October for the Christmas season.
We do have cycles, however, because each month can be so different, and a lot of the things we do in the shop, we have book launches, we have to plan in for these events to buy in the stock for exhibitions and events, so that we do plan a lot around what's happening in the museum. So for example, Graft is our exhibition that started in February. We started to look sort of the previous quarter at what stock we wanted to get in for that, what bespoke stock we wanted to be made, you know, looking into suppliers, what we could get for children.
We plan in a lot of detail. We look at what we have sold, we look at what hasn't sold, you learn from both.
But it's a constant process. We do annual forecasting, so once a year we will sit down and look at our entire budget for the year and create our targets. But again, that will be looked at 6 months down the line and possibly reforecast depending on how the year's going.
Okay, so let's think about the annual planning cycle for buying and creating all these fantastic product ranges that you're going to be selling. And I'd suggest the annual buying cycle has kind of 5 key parts to it, and deciding what time of the year you do each of these will depend on when your key selling period is. So these 5 phases of the buying cycle I'm going to talk to you about now will vary from organisation to organisation depending on the seasonality of your visits coming through. So if you could imagine this as a circle, as a cycle that goes round literally like a wheel, but at the heart, in the centre, where all the spokes radiate out of, is the overall museum strategy, which interrelates back into your retail strategy, out of which your product strategy comes. So there's the kind of museum and all the strategic thinking that you've done at the heart of everything, and radiating out of that are the 5 phases of your cycle. So the first thing to do when you get towards the end of your successful trading period, whether it's summer, spring, autumn, whatever, is analysis and evaluation. So this first step in the buying cycle about evaluation and data analysis is absolutely critical, because you really want to understand how many lines you've got in the business and what percentage of profit each of those lines individually has contributed back to the success of the shop. So what happens very commonly is you'll find you've got the 80-20 rule, the Pareto analysis, which is that a very high percentage of your turnover comes from a relatively small number of your lines. The second bit is actually to sit down and think about the planning. And that plan can be quite simple, again, back to a simple grid table, which just shows the overall number of lines you want to have in the business. And then within each of those categories, what ranges they break down into, and what sort of level of profit you're expecting. So you can think about those new lines that you're seeking out, whether you're going to be sourcing those from existing suppliers, or whether they're bespoke lines which you're going to have created specially for you. So the third step in the planning or in the buying cycle is the implementation. So that's when you take all your data analysis and background work that you've done, all your planning, and you start to put it together. And this is the kind of creative bit, I'd suggest, where you're using your visual senses, but also your knowledge of suppliers. And a buyer is only as ever as good as their supplier base. And having good suppliers who are reliable is just so important in terms of what we do. And it's finding those unusual and quite quirky suppliers, perhaps, who can work with you and understand what your museum or your collection is all about. So you can start to create those ranges and put those together. And you've launched the new ranges, and we'll talk a little bit later about some of the timings of how all of that happens, but you've launched the new ranges into the shop, and hopefully they're selling a lot, but keep an eye on them, because one of the great things that people sometimes forget about is actually the money that you lose by not having the right stock there. So we all tend to focus on how much overstock we've got, hopefully not too much, but we sometimes lose sight of the stock outs of the top selling lines. And this is kind of where we come back to that mantra I mentioned about 100% availability of your key selling lines. Just keep having a look on a weekly basis and just seeing what's selling, what needs to be reordered, and anticipating. So rather than waiting till a stock line has actually sold out, if it's selling well, anticipate that and get more stock in before it does actually go out of stock. And then the final step is coming back up to the top of the cycle again and just thinking about how you overall assess what's been going on and any tweaks that you need to make to your buying cycle again, ready to start again for the next year. So it's also, as part of this, it's thinking about what your margins are and what your overall margin you want to achieve. So back to that example of a turnover of £120,000 a year, excluding VAT, if you're working on an average margin of 50%, that would then be giving you a budget to spend on stock of £60,000 a year. And if your peak sales months were perhaps during July and August, then you'd be wanting to bring in enough stock to make those sales in May, June time.
So how do you prepare a purchase budget? Well, firstly, you must prepare a sales budget. So you must know how much you are budgeting to take in a year before you can determine how much you should spend on stock. So once you've prepared your sales budget and you've phased your sales budget over the year, then you can put in a proposed purchase budget for each month of the year. And by monitoring these closely, you can actually adjust them. So if your sales are far better in April or in May than you expected, then you should be able to spend more money in the following month than you had budgeted. And likewise, if they're worse, you should cut back. But you cannot keep spending regardless of the sales.
We're not in this as a game. We are in this to make money for the institution that we're supporting. And you can't do that if you're not agile and if you're not prepared to make a change where a change needs to happen. You then review the product ranges as well. Can we sell more merchandise that's more expensive? Can we sell more merchandise that's got a higher profit margin? But if you got it right all the time, I wouldn't be here. I'd be running a chain of shops called Chris Needham. When I worked more on the high street, I remember Roger Bromley, as in Russell and Bromley, saying at a sales conference showing the new season's ranges to us, somebody asked him a question and said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, this is fashion. If you don't get it wrong 40% of the time, you're not bloody well trying." Now, we're not in fashion, but I take that to heart a bit. You've got to stretch, you've got to push, you've got to try. You've also got to know when you failed. And when you fail, clear it. Put it in a sale, mark it down hard, get rid of it, put the money back in the bank and experiment with something else.
To souvenir or not to souvenir? That is the question we'll be asking in the next edition of CultureShop.
We'll be looking at the role of the souvenir and why people want to take home a little piece of the museum.
And why the best bespoke products are so much more than just a logo on a mug.
Join us again on CultureShop.
All the best.
Bye.